Hello, good afternoon and good morning. My name is Andrew O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies here at Monticello. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 11th annual conference with the American Academy of Diplomacy on the topic, Does Europe Still Matter to America? The American Academy of Diplomacy exists to explain to the public the importance of diplomacy as a tool of national security. They are in the best tradition of Thomas Jefferson, who consistently favored negotiation, dialogue, and diplomacy over military solutions. Jefferson served as the US representative to France and later as Secretary of State in the first Washington administration. As Secretary of State in 1794, he wrote from Monticello, "As to myself, I love peace, and I'm anxious that we should give the world still another useful lesson by showing to them other modes of punishing injuries than by war, which is as much a punishment to the punisher as to the sufferer." In retirement at the age of 77 at Monticello, his views about diplomacy had not changed when he wrote that a government of reason is better than one of force. The Academy is bipartisan. The members often disagree with one another over policy issues, but are united in their desire to serve their country. Many of the members have served in some of the most dangerous postings and volunteer their time to speak at events such as today. This is a collaboration that we at Monticello value as part of our mission to promote a global dialogue through Thomas Jefferson. The International Center for Jefferson Studies hold at least one foreign conference abroad every year. Last year, we were hosted by the University of Liverpool and the Museum of International Slavery, discussing the topic of capitalism and slavery on the 75th anniversary of the publication of a book by the same title, written by Eric Williams, the independence leader and prime minister in Trinidad and Tobago. Towards the end of next year, we still hope at least to be in Cartagena in Colombia with a comparative conference about colonial independence leaders. We traditionally begin our conferences with the Academy with a talk that emphasizes the historical perspective on diplomacy. And today will be addressed by Tyson Reeder, an author and professor at the University of Virginia. It will still be possible for the audience to engage in Q&A following presentations by our panelists and keynote address at the end of the conference by Charles Rifkin, who is not only former ambassador to France and Morocco, but also currently CEO of the motion picture industry. We generally dispense with long personal introductions. The conference program and biographies of the participants are available on our website, www.monticello.org, under Research and Education and Scholarly Conferences. I'd like to end my introduction by thanking those who've helped to make today possible, including the University of Virginia Center for Politics, represented by Professor Damon Irby, Whitney Pippin, the Scholarly Programs Coordinator at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, Matt Hare in our IT office, and John McKee in our marketing office, as well as Danielle De Almina, who is in our events department. I'd also like to thank, among the American Academy of Diplomacy staff, Maria Reisenhaus and Destiny Clements. I particularly want to thank our next speaker, Ron Newman, who's president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and was most recently posted as ambassador in Afghanistan. He's also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ron Newman.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually, although I must say I definitely regret not being with you in person. The annual trip to Charlottesville and Mount Alto has been a regular feature of our lives and the Academy programming for some time. And I must say that wonderful as this link is, it certainly is not a substitute for sitting up in your beautiful conference center. But we are glad to be back with you, and we definitely appreciate the continuing cooperation with the Jefferson Center and with you and with all your colleagues. And a special thanks to Whitney, who has collaborated with us, and Maria and Destiny Clements from my office, who have worked so hard so that I and my colleagues kind of just show up and do our thing, but they do all the work behind the scenes to make this possible. I also want to note one person who cannot be with us today, and that's Dr. Rui Ramazani. Rui was part of your board. He was a figure of the University of Virginia for many years. He was really the dean of Iranian studies. I first met him when I was taking over the office of Iran and Iraq in the State Department after the first Gulf War. Drove down to see him, and we remained friends until he died. And he was the one who first put us together with the Jefferson Center. And he, after a couple of years, we decided when this became a little more regular, we would turn regularly to Rui at the end of one session and say, okay, what do we want to talk about next year? And he would invariably stimulate us and come up with some kind of an idea. And I don't know if Nesta, his wife, is listening today, but I miss him in the program. So just a word about the American Academy of Diplomacy. It's now a little over 80 years old. It is still a small organization of people who have held senior positions in the practice of diplomacy, and members elect other members. We never elect everybody on the ballot, so the election to the Academy does still have some meaning. It is an organization which is a little bit like an honor society, a think tank, and a lobby. It works to promote, strengthen American diplomacy. That's our catchphrase. And it does this by pushing at the department and at Congress. It has had some success in getting work into legislation. And it also spends time trying to talk to Americans about why diplomacy is important. And this program is very much a feature of that. And I think I will come back to a more detailed introduction later, but we thought this year it was really worth talking about this question of, does Europe matter? And I suppose one could answer yes, or as one of my colleagues was joking, he'll just answer no, and then his speech is done. But in fact, what we're seeing is that there are contradictory elements, and Americans tend to discuss them in silos. So you have Russia pushing into Ukraine. Why can't we all get together and push back? We have commercial trade issues with the EU. Wait a minute, what's the matter with those damn Europeans? We have a variety of issues in NATO, in and out of the area. These things cut across each other. And then the fact remains that Europe is a huge trading partner, which many Americans, I think, manage to ignore as they focus on one or another individual issue. And so that's why we thought this is something that is worth bringing some joint focus on. And we have been dealing with America and Europe together and apart, and interference one way and another since the earliest days, since we sent diplomats abroad to solicit French support for the American Revolution. So it is a great subject, I think, to tie together the current problems and interests of America and foreign policy, diplomacy, and the history reaching back to Jefferson. So with that, I'm happy. I'm not, Andrew, are you going to introduce Tyson? Or
I think you can go ahead.
All right, well, I won't do the formal introduction, but Tyson Reeder is an excellent professor to bring this focus, start us on this long focus. He has edited the papers of James Madison. He's delved into this area. His full bio is in the program notes that I think everybody has access to electronically. Usually I'd say you have them in your hand because we'd be sitting in Mount Alto and everybody could busily flip their pages, but they are there electronically. And as we're doing with our other participants, we won't do detailed introductions on the web. So Dr. Reeder, may I pass to you?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Newman, and also Dr. O'Shaughnessy. And thank you to everybody at Monticello and the International Center for Jefferson Studies and the American Academy of Diplomacy for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be speaking with PowerPoint, so let me pull this up. Okay, is that coming through on PowerPoint?
It is.
Oh, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So the theme of this conference, of course, is Does Europe Still Matter? And however the distinguished panelists answer that question, my answer is that certainly the history of Europe still matters to Americans, and we have a great deal to learn from that history. So let me set the stage. American democracy teetered on crisis. The sitting US president had misused public money to obtain potentially incriminating information about his political rivals during an election season. He had no hard evidence of criminal conduct, but he subscribed to conspiracy theories that foreign actors held legal dirt he could use against the opposing party. To get his hands on the information, the president worked with shadow diplomats who had close ties to a foreign government. Knowing that his maneuvers would stir controversy, he tried to conceal his actions from Congress and the public, but word leaked out. When his political opponents learned what he had done, they stormed the media to warn the public that the president had improperly consorted with a foreign enemy. They accused him of endangering national security for his own political benefit. The year was 1812. The president was James Madison. Now, early American brawls over foreign meddling and foreign collusion climaxed months later with the eruption of the near disastrous War of 1812. And to get a taste of how Americans summoned that catastrophe, we can start by eavesdropping on a conversation in 1789, likely at the New York City home of Alexander Hamilton on Wall Street. That fall, the British agent George Beckwith carried orders from British Canada to collect intelligence about US politics. Beckwith slipped into New York in late September, somewhere between an unofficial emissary and a secret agent. A petty spy is how one associate described him. His superiors hoped the mission would help them defeat James Madison's anti-British legislation in Congress. Beckwith needed an American contact with an influential voice close to the president, and Treasury Secretary Hamilton was perfect. At the time, Hamilton and Madison were emerging as leaders of an amorphous two-party system, with Madison mobilizing Republicans in Congress and Hamilton advocating for Federalists in the cabinet. Madison argued that Congress should use its powers under the newly implemented Constitution to essentially declare a trade war on Britain, endangering Hamilton's vision of a close commercial relationship with the former mother country. In October 1789, Hamilton met Beckwith without the knowledge or sanction of President Washington. In the meeting, Hamilton assured the intelligence agent that the president and most senators would reject Madison's plan. The intelligence stilled the British government against US threats, injuring America's bargaining power. Together, Hamilton and Beckwith defeated Madison. The Treasury Secretary considered the partnership really nothing more than a political maneuver, cutthroat politics perhaps, but hardly treason. If Beckwith invited Federalists into a shady area between foreign diplomacy and foreign collusion, a brazen, gregarious French diplomat did the same for Republicans. The French Revolution had intensified political debates in the United States. Federalists denounced its seemingly senseless violence, while Jefferson, Madison, and their fellow Republicans applauded its goals. Especially after the French Revolutionary government declared war on Britain, the revolution drew battle lines between Federalists' affinity for Britain and Republicans' fondness of France. In 1793, Edmond Charles Genet arrived as the revolutionary government's diplomat and heightened the stakes of the debate. Genet lambasted Washington's policy of neutrality. When Washington refused to abandon course, Genet turned from a nuisance into a rogue. He outfitted privateers in US ports to sail against Britain. He attacked Washington in Republican newspapers, and he tried to organize an illegal American invasion of British Canada. The impetuous minister put Madison and Jefferson in a bind, especially after he invited Secretary of State Jefferson to aid his scheme in Canada. The more troublesome Genet grew, the more Federalists accused Republicans of conniving with France. So here you can see Genet surrounded, a political cartoon of a Federalist depiction of Genet surrounded by a lot of unseemly Republicans, with the devil supervising the gathering and Genet holding a plan for the entire subversion of the government. Now, 2 years later, British Minister George Hammond held a stack of papers sure to turn Americans against Washington's new Republican-leaning Secretary of State, Edmund Randolph. A British warship had intercepted official dispatches from the new French minister, Joseph Fauché. If he squinted hard enough, Hammond could convince himself that the documents bore evidence of Randolph's collusion with the French. He slipped the purloined dispatches into the hands of leading Federalists and waited for American partisanship to work its magic. Federalist Secretary of War Timothy Pickering biased the French translation to reveal the documents in their worst light. The revelations incensed the president, who demanded Randolph's resignation. Now, the news couldn't have come at a worse time for Madison or a better one for Federalists. Since 1794, Madison had combated the Washington administration's attempts to sign a treaty that he feared would subjugate the United States to Britain. With Randolph's resignation, Madison lost his ally in the cabinet. As they accused each other of corruption, Federalists and Republicans widened the chasm in which foreign agents could operate, especially when it came to presidential elections. In 1795, Pierre-Auguste Adet arrived in the United States with instructions to, quote, tie himself closely to the party that favors France and guide it without exposing himself. With Federalists in control of Washington's cabinet, Adet resolved to drag Republicans across the finish line in the upcoming presidential election. He toured the country, rallying Americans in support of Jefferson, whom Madison had pressured to run for the office. He worked with a Republican strategist to publish letters that implied Federalists would embroil the United States in war with France, and those letters hinted that only Jefferson's election could avert the disaster. In 1796, Americans plodded to the polls amid a flurry of accusations and counter-accusations of foreign collusion. Federalist John Adams won a narrow victory. By 1798, convinced that Republicans operated as French stooges, Federalists passed the Sedition Act, prohibiting criticism of John Adams's administration. Jefferson and Madison accused Federalists of stifling the voice of the people to advance British ambitions. For their part, Federalists accused Jefferson of sacrificing US independence and the Constitution on the altar of France. In one of the bitterest presidential elections in history, Jefferson wrenched the presidency from John Adams in 1800. As war raged between Britain and France, the two European powers caught Americans in the middle. Jefferson and Secretary of State Madison faulted both empires for violating US sovereignty, but they viewed Britain as the worst offender. In 1807, to the dismay of Federalists, Republicans passed the Embargo Act, halting all foreign exports until Europeans respected American neutrality. Because Federalist New England depended on trade with Britain, Federalists decried the act as a ploy to punish them for their politics. They reverted to the canard floated by British agents that Jefferson and Madison colluded with France, depicting them as puppets of Napoleon. And here you can see Jefferson and Madison restraining US shipping at the orders of Napoleon. In the spring of 1808, John Howe arrived in Boston as a British secret agent to report on the state of the political parties. As Howe surveyed the depression in New England caused by the Republicans' embargo, he sent good news to Governor General George Prevost of British Nova Scotia. New Englanders, he said, appear more disposed to blame their own government than ours for their problems. If the discontent remained, they might launch Federalists back to power in the 1808 elections. Now, Howe suggested that Jefferson would hang himself politically if given enough rope, but Prevost thought Federalists could use some extra incentive to hate the administration. At the same time that he dispatched Howe, Prevost planted conspiracy theories warning Federalists that Napoleon wanted to occupy Canada and revolutionize the United States in the French image. Here we can see Napoleon conspiring with Jefferson to implement the embargo and become king. Now, elite Federalists, known as the Essex Junto, recommended to the British minister, George Rose, that England maintain its naval policies, certain that they would ruin Jefferson and Madison. This piece of British propaganda depicted Madison pleading with Napoleon and the devil for help to win the 1808 presidential election, even as British secret agents tried to secure Federalist victories. As Howe surveyed the political scene in 1808, he rejoiced that, quote, "it is nearly a certainty that Mr. Madison will not be the president." Well, the following March, Madison stood in the House chamber and raised his right hand to take the presidential oath of office. While Madison escalated his demand for war against the British in early 1812, he found a chance to discredit Federalists as the final threat to America's national security. The president thought fate had smiled on him that election year, dropping in his lap evidence of a British Federalist conspiracy. He had no idea he was being played by a French con artist with the help of the French ambassador. The con artist, Paul-Émile Soubiron, masqueraded as the fictitious Count Edouard de Crillon and teamed with a former British spy named John Henry. Henry told Soubiron about documents he had retained from a secret mission to determine if Federalists might consider severing their stronghold of New England from the United States. The con artist, Soubiron, proposed that they cooperate with the French government to sell the papers to the Madison administration and swindle a profit off the US government. Once in the United States, they related their plan to the French minister in Washington, Louis Serrurier. The minister cautiously favored the scheme in hope that it would alert Madison to British intrigues and push the United States closer to war with Britain. Careful not to dirty his own hands, he used Soubiron as a sort of shadow representative. The team convinced Madison that the documents would prove a conspiracy between Federalists and Britain. Intrigued, the president purchased the stash for an enormous amount of public money. To his own embarrassment, he learned that although the papers revealed British connivance, they contained no incriminating information about his political opposition. Federalists riddled Madison with charges of misconduct for using public money to purchase documents meant to discredit their party. Madison countercharged that the British had employed Henry to subvert the US government. He called for war. With the purchase of the documents, Madison epitomized the irony of foreign collusion. Partisans colluded with foreign powers because they feared their opponents colluded with foreign powers. Foreign meddling had corroded US political discourse to the point that Madison could only assume that his political opponents acted with criminal intent. party distrust outweighed the threat of foreign intervention. To eradicate the British threat, Madison and congressional Republicans plunged the nation into an avoidable war. 2 years into the war, British troops left the capital in flames. The fires warned Americans how close they stood to defeat. Now, Americans did eke out a draw in the War of 1812, but they celebrated it as a victory. As a surge of national pride gripped the country, few considered how partisan conflict had aided foreign meddling and led to an unnecessary war that almost shattered the Republic. Days before flames scorched Washington, State Department Clerk Stephen Pleasanton, almost on a whim, removed the original Declaration of Independence and Constitution from the Capitol. In a fitting metaphor, partisan malice and foreign meddling nearly left the founding charters in ashes. Americans didn't arrive at that crisis due to their political differences. They arrived there because they confused opposition with corruption. Americans today can choose a different fate. To avoid the errors of the past, they don't need to extinguish political parties or obliterate partisanship. They need to fight partisan battles without making criminals of political opponents, without mistaking dissent for disloyalty. Thank you.
That was a lovely, lovely speech, Dr. Reeder. And I now feel much better about our current politics. Not in the sense that, we haven't at least gone to war yet, but definitely in the sense that it does help one to know that we've been here before and the Republic has survived. And as we go into the court fight, I was reading the other day that after Adams was defeated, before Jefferson took office, Adams went ahead and appointed a new Chief Justice who Jefferson despised, who happened to be John Marshall. And so it is useful, I think, to all of us as we take a deep breath to remind her that these things have happened before. So I think we have time for some questions, and I don't know exactly in what form they're coming to us.
They would come, I think, on the Q&A if people would like to write their questions that can be found at the bottom of the screen. Although we could take a few verbally as well.
Well, I will pose one while we're waiting, and that is, did one see a waning of this constant back and forth between political parties and foreign intervention or foreign connivance? Or, I mean, we seem to think now that this is a new thing. You've reminded us that it is not a new thing at all, but was there an ebb and flow here, or have we just lost focus?
I think there is an ebb and flow. Now, of course, my expertise is the early Republic, getting later into the 19th century. I'm not entirely aware of this same level of foreign intervention combined with really strong party disputes. For one, at least during the Monroe administration, there was a bit of a lull in this sort of party animus. And so that took a break, for at least for several years. Now, certainly, partisanship and sectional differences, of course, result in the Civil War by the mid-19th century. But in terms of what foreign governments were doing, I'm not aware of this same level of foreign intervention. We do start to see more of this in the 1960s and 1970s. There were levels of foreign intervention, but I think there is a sort of ebb and flow. I think that we're not constantly, and we don't have to constantly live in this terrible cycle of partisanship exacerbating foreign meddling, which exacerbates partisanship, and staying in this cycle. There is an ebb and flow to it, from what I can see.
I wonder if we have become less aware of this simply because of the way we teach history. Um, I was reading Robert Zoellick's book on American diplomacy recently, and I was struck by the fact that we teach the Louisiana Purchase as a very sort of simplified fashion. Jefferson sends envoys out to buy the city. They end up buying half the continent. Napoleon's broke, needs money, and it offers it, and they grab it, and that's the end of story. And the Zoellick book, which is not original history, but it reminding one of how Jefferson maneuvered with threats of war, but without quite making the threats, of how there was maneuvering back and forth politically with Great Britain to bring pressure on France to keep them from dispatching an army, and a much more complicated diplomacy. And a reminder that this kind of mix of threat and pressure and money has been part of diplomacy and makes diplomacy work often. It's not just a great policy decision, but also this complex interaction with multiple countries that we've sort of obliterated from the way we teach the subject of the Louisiana Purchase.
Right. I think the Louisiana Purchase is great to bring up, and I didn't have time to cover this, but I do write about it in my book, in that Madison and Jefferson saw the Louisiana Purchase not just as a great deal for America, a great bargain for America, but they viewed it as a coup against foreign intervention. A lot of the foreign intervention they worried about was coming from the West, because they Americans felt surrounded by Spanish Empire, and then the French Empire, and the British Empire to the north. And so when they purchased Louisiana, they thought that they were not just expanding the country, but that they were, again, laying a coup against any French threat from the West, where Napoleon could try to sever the West from the Union, or in some way try to still American sovereignty. And so they viewed this really as beneficial for America against France. But Federalists, again, when you're stuck in this cycle of partisanship, Federalists interpreted this as a sort of corrupt, even unconstitutional bargain with France. And I think in a lot of ways, I can certainly speak to James Madison, that sort of changes the way he thinks about minority politics. In the 1790s, he was in the minority, and he really sort of showcased the minority opposition of accusing the government of colluding with a foreign power to maintain its own power. And here, the tables are being turned on Madison. And thereafter, he actually starts to use a lot more of the same logic that Federalists had used, that the minority party is the one you have to be aware of, because it will collude with a foreign power to try to destabilize the government for its own benefit. And so you do get this cycle, and I think the Louisiana Purchase is indicative of the cycle and the types of politics that are being played in it.
Fascinating. I have one question. Did the foreign, this maybe goes a little beyond your scope, but did the foreign intervention, that the kind of intervention you described, contribute to or motivate Monroe in declaring the Monroe Doctrine?
Oh, yeah, I think this is fascinating. And after, in my previous book, I argue that the years 1818 to 1820 are really critical years when the United States starts to feel a sort of sense of its own growing power. And part of this comes out of the War of 1812, where they don't feel quite as vulnerable to European powers. And so they begin to essentially meddle in other empires' internal politics. And they, and so that is sort of culminated with Monroe's declaration that no Europeans could recolonize the Americas. He was, of course, speaking, for those unaware, he was speaking about South American revolutions where Spanish and Portuguese America had recently cut ties with their European governments. And so this does hark back to the idea that Europeans, if Europeans are on the continent, they are going to meddle in the affairs of of the US government. And Monroe kind of wants to get out in front of that. And there is a lot of American interference in the Spanish Empire when it comes to their independence movements. So yes, I think that it definitely is related to this and harks back to this idea that if Europeans are in the Americas, if they're neighbors with Americans, they're going to cause problems in America's politics.
Thank you. It is really, it's a fascinating discussion because when you think about this intertwining of the foreign with the American, it's sort of like a funhouse mirror that the image, there is a reality in the image, and yet it is distorted. And sometimes it's distorted beyond all recognition, although it reflects somebody standing in front of the mirror. And this is a bit the way each of our parties has in a sense looked at this foreign intervention. Well, Dr. Reeder, I really thank you for this quite brilliant introduction. I think, Andrew, that this is actually one of the best such kind of harking back to Jefferson introductions we've had, because the tie is so wonderfully tight and gives us so much perspective as we go forward. And so, Dr. Reeder, I wish we had a way of applauding with the audience, but we've got them all cut off, so they can't do that. But thank you again very much for this. It's really quite a fascinating introduction.
Thank you.
Andrew, a great pick on your part. We divide this labor up. Andrew always gets to pick the first speaker. I get to put the panel together. So now turning to my responsibilities, we have 3 panelists with excellent background to look from different perspectives at the subject of Europe. Does it matter, and how our involvement with Europe works? It's a bit like taking the question like a crystal and turning it from one side to another to look at it with different facets. And so we've got Ambassador Pamela Spratlen, who has been ambassador in Uzbekistan, in Kyrgyzstan, and in the Kyrgyz Republic, all of which have to deal with heavy Soviet and Russian involvement, and various jobs in Washington as well. Again, I remind you the detailed bios are on the web. And Pamela is going to start us looking a bit from this idea of looking from the Russian press inward. She's going to be followed by Robert Hunter, I believe we agreed. And Robert was ambassador to NATO, but has served in various White Houses in policy operations, writes extensively, and will come then from a different perspective. And then, lest we get too caught up with power politics and sort of looking from pure political perspectives, Shaun Donnelly, who has been deeply involved in various aspects of trade and economic affairs, also been ambassador to Sri Lanka, but with a variety of different economic experiences, and very active in the academy on working on current day economic issues with the Department of Commerce, is going to come in and give us a bit more on the economic perspective. So with that introduction, let me pass to Ambassador Spratlen. Pamela, take it away.
Well, Ron, thank you very much for your introduction. Thanks to everyone who is part of this panel and program this morning. This is the first time I'm joining it, and I'm very honored to be here. And I'd like to thank the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Monticello organizers for the invitation. I'd especially like to welcome our high school and college students. I've been told that we have some in our virtual audience today. And just to let them know that we need their curiosity and energy to help us think about how to approach the hard questions of our nation's future and indeed the world, because they aren't going to be thinking in a 4 or 8 year political cycle. They've got a lot of road ahead of them and many, many changes that will come in the future. So I want to thank them for giving up a Saturday to join us. I've been asked to speak a little bit about Russia's global ambitions and how they figure in this question of whether Europe matters to us in our calculations. And I'll just say at the top that I do think that Europe matters. It's interesting to me that there's even a question, but I look forward to hearing people who think not. But I want to actually start in a slightly different place because I think it helps to understand where Russia's coming from and how it sees itself as a global power. I want to start by referencing a speech that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave on September 24th. And he gave the speech to the most powerful UN members, those on the Security Council. This was in the context of a briefing on COVID-19. He decried the tendency towards ad hoc solutions because he considered the pandemic something that could have been planned for by the international community. And he was also concerned about the growing splits in the international community. And he concluded in this speech, quote, "We experienced fragmentation and polarization without effective mechanisms of multilateral governance 100 years ago. The result was the First World War, followed by the Second. We have no choice. Either we come together in global institutions that are fit for purpose, or we will be crushed by divisiveness and chaos," unquote. Now, on September 28th, President Putin addressed the UN General Assembly, and he seemed to take up the Secretary General's challenge in a way that shows how Moscow wants the world to view Russia as a constructive global power. And we'll talk a little bit about other facets of Russian power later. President Putin spoke in a taped address flanked by the Russian and UN flags. And for anyone who knew nothing about Russia, he sounded thoughtful, compassionate, and entirely like a normal leader. He spoke with pride about Moscow's role as a founding UN member, about the international cooperation that rose above ideological differences after World War II. He stressed the importance of the UN Charter as the basis for international law. He made the case for Russia as a humanitarian force, offering Russia's new vaccine for the coronavirus and proposing a G5 summit. On security, Putin asserted Russia's interest in ensuring that space should not be militarized, and he stressed that his country is ready to sign on to an extension of the New START treaty, assuring the continuation of a key mechanism in arms control. And of course, as Russia is a major nuclear power, this is again showing how they see themselves. It all portrayed Russia as a model international citizen and contributor in world affairs. And I think that's overall the global ambition. And this is closely tied to the cultivated image of Russia as a leading world player, as a defender of stability in hard places. And an example there includes Russia's support for the authoritarian petrostate of Venezuela, where Putin, not in the UN context, but separately, has warned the United States not to interfere with stable authority, although it looks like Venezuela looks like authoritarian oppression to us. Similarly, in Syria, Russia shores up the regime in the name of stability and puts forward a positive image as a loyal ally that wants to forestall the arrival of jihadists. And of course, all of this is part of the agenda is Russia working hard to avert what it sees as US engineered regime change. So what this global image requires is a foundation. And for Moscow, that foundation is a strong central government buffered by dependent states in a zone of dominion. And this was a multi-century project of imperial Russia as the country strived over a very long period to assert this vision, all the while in search of a warm water port. Now, the project came to a screeching halt, as we all know, in 1917, when imperial authority in St. Petersburg failed utterly to manage both the growing internal demands of a poor and lagging country and the requirements of a global leadership that came crashing down with the disastrous performance of Russia's military in World War I. Throughout much of the 20th century after the arrival of the communists, the USSR worked both to expand its geographic reach and its ideological appeal by seduction and or force. A brutal effort by Joseph Stalin turned the country into a major industrial power in a surprisingly short period of time. By mid-century, Moscow was strong enough to become a central player with European allies and the United States in the triumph over Nazi Germany. And Moscow took a prize place at Yalta, which is that famous photo we've all seen. The World War II victory remains a feat of great pride, celebrated annually in Moscow and throughout the former USSR. The USSR joined the United Nations as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, assuring a privileged place of global power and prestige in 1945. And this is something that Putin noted in his speech. But of course, after World War II, old cleavages quickly reasserted themselves, and the United States and the USSR soon veered into the Cold War and competition, ushering in decades of steadily rising levels of mistrust. The nuclear program, as well as its space triumphs, led to global competition that ultimately required both the United States and the USSR to cooperate, particularly to reduce the nuclear threat through arms control agreements. But throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the USSR seemed to be a forever global power locked in frightful competition with the West. Inside, however, the Soviet project became increasingly stagnant, restive, and unsustainable, depleted by wasteful failures such as the Afghan conflict. Despite the last-ditch efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev to remake and reform the Soviet colossus and sustain the global power, in 1991, to the surprise of most, the USSR collapsed, an event Putin has famously called, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the history of the 20th century. For Putin, a central task of the past almost 30 years has been to stabilize the country while securing his own wealth and prestige, but also trying to restore the great power status that was lost in the Soviet collapse. And from his standpoint, the greatest obstacle is the vision of the West for a Europe, quote unquote, whole, free, and at peace. In 1991, as many in the audience know and participated in, the audience embarked on a breathtaking policy of remaking the former Soviet world. And that vision consisted of recognizing newly independent states, of especially those who were trapped inside the USSR, of providing these new countries with stabilizing humanitarian assistance, making market-based economic reforms, vastly expanding people-to-people contacts, and reducing the potential for nuclear accidents, both from weapon systems and the scientists who created them. And of course, Europe was central to this vision of change. And what was a triumph for, say, the Baltic states in Eastern Europe spelled humiliation and insecurity for Russia. By the mid-1990s, Moscow was again gaining strength. It did not have the power to stop NATO and EU expansion, but it had enough self-assurance to reassert its historical posture that Russia must be a great power, pursuing its own interests at home and in countries within its immediate sphere of influence. And since then, common ground between Russia, America, and the United States has been harder. Now, the other part is what about Europe? Europe is, in my view, very important to this whole question, not only because of the EU institutions, but because Europe, even thinking larger than these institutional considerations, is in some ways our mirror. It's our way of trying to understand the world, because European societies resemble ours more than many other societies in the world. But in a geopolitical sense, it's also the connective tissue for the United States and our debacle with Russia in the context of Europe. After 1991, the European Union welcomed new members and grew quickly. The soaring fortunes of successful aspirants to Western institutions encouraged others, but the Russians disrupted this process whenever possible, as in Serbia, Kosovo, 1999, the pushback to color revolutions of the early 2000s, and the attempt by Georgia to move towards NATO in 2008. By 2014, when Ukraine declared its intentions to move toward the EU, Russia had had enough, seized Crimea, and launched militarized operations in eastern Ukraine that have resisted all attempts at resolution. Despite the Minsk Protocol and efforts by Europe and the OSCE, as well as the United States, the conflict continues with no end in sight. Again, Europe is critical to this. Meanwhile, as important as Europe is to us in sustaining the positive progress in many Soviet countries, the European bloc itself is showing signs of strain and division. Brexit is the most obvious, but anti-immigration moves in different places, still a sense that Brussels is too much out of touch, and there's the worrying sign of right-leaning governments in European states like Hungary. Unfortunately, in the last few years, the United States has struggled to lead the way through this turmoil. There is no agreement in our policy establishment or in Congress about US goals, timing, or tactics with respect to Russia. Complicating things further is our president's more laissez-faire attitude towards Russia's malign behavior, even on meddling in US elections in 2016 and now by Russia. He has downplayed the importance of World War II alliances and has not moved decisively to reaffirm the importance of arms control as an important regime for the whole world by extending the New START treaty, although there is hope this might happen soon. The policy disputes in Washington leave our allies confused. They are ready for US leadership, but we are not delivering. Putin's Russia is under pressure, but can hold its own in an uncertain global environment that struggles to condemn the poisoning of a comparatively weak oppositionist in a foreign country, or Russia's threat of military intervention in neighboring Belarus. Despite calls from our best and brightest experts to make Russia pay a higher price for its malign behavior at home and abroad, there is no consensus in Washington or even in European capitals about how to achieve this. In all of this, the COVID-19 pandemic, a racial reckoning over the killing of George Floyd, voter suppression, and the economic challenges that have come from the coronavirus are weighing down the American people. Nonetheless, as we all know, US voters will decide on November 3rd, not only the fate of US-Russia relations and our ties to Europe, but whether, more broadly speaking, the rules-based order that the UN Secretary General asked the most powerful states to reaffirm can still bring us peace and security. With this, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you for your attention and turn the floor back over to the moderator, Ron.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I think that's a great introduction and shaping. And I'm going to see if Robert Hunter, Ambassador Hunter, is with us. And Robert, if you would come back on screen, we would pass the microphone to you, sir.
Starting the video is up to you folks. That's what it says here. There you go. Okay. There we go.
There. You're
okay.
live.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be at Monticello once again and to learn that marvelous history lessons from two people now, including the one we've just heard from Ambassador Spratlen. For everybody out there of all generations, including in particular the younger people, history matters. And one of our greatest challenges, particularly in the last 20 years, is we're forgetting about history, including a lot of our own history. And unless we come to a better focus on how we got to where we are, we're not going to have a clue about where we're going. So that's my basic lesson. All right, question, does Europe matter? As the ambassador just said, surprised that anybody raises that question, but lots of people do. Certain facts, geography, history, and economics, end of case. Question whether we do it well or do it badly. Recent years, we haven't been doing it terribly well. Some of it actually began before Mr. Trump, certainly now, and then we'll see what happens after the election. We really have no choice but to deal effectively with Europe. Just don't have a choice unless we're just chuckleheads. We can't be a turtle again. the way we were, at least towards Europe in the 1930s. Pearl Harbor ended our isolation forever. 9/11 ended our insulation forever. If you don't get that, you're just not in the game. Okay, NATO. NATO has always been in trouble. People always saying, does it have a future? Well, partly because it's not static. The world isn't static. But we keep coming up with correctly, I think, with the right answer. Yes, NATO matters very much. It keeps changing, but it does matter. In the post-Cold War world, immediately we said, why do we need it? We won the Cold War. Let's come home. A lot of people understood that NATO, under two administrations, George H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton, had to deal with the aftermath of Cold War in Europe and did so successfully. And then NATO, people used to say, what's the point now? I said, it's an insurance policy. It's a cheap insurance policy, and it helps promote stability in one of the most fractious areas in the entire world. Now, and also predictability. So we have some kind of sense of what's happening there. All right, there are two kinds of benefits to the United States. One are negative. To begin with, beyond Ukraine, there's no war in Europe. 100 years ago, or even, let's say, go back to the mid 1990s, it'd be very hard to say that particular thing, even though the Cold War did freeze wars for a while. No war, and a large part of that's because of NATO. Is because 29 countries now belong to NATO, and a number of others are associated with it. And if you want to be part of the NATO world, one of the things you have to pledge is give up your historical quarrels with your neighbors. For example, with Hungary and Romania, who wanted to go back hammer and tongs over Transylvania once again, we told them, you want to be involved in NATO? Give it a rest. Well, they both did. That's a good thing. And also, NATO also helps to contain other problems. Now, yes, there's always a problem between Greece and Turkey, and has been since 1923. In fact, since 1823. Let's look at history. But it hasn't come to open war. I mean, they buzz planes back and forth, and there are major disagreements now over resources in hydrocarbon resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. But NATO helps to keep that in check. The British and the Spaniards don't go to war over Gibraltar. The British and the Icelanders managed to sort out the problem of fish. A lot of that happens simply because of NATO. And also, let's face it, along with the European Union, the French and the Germans are friends and are not going to go to war. Everybody say, what do you mean go to war? Well, between 1870 and 1945, they were at war almost constantly. Well, NATO is very important to that. Okay, that's a negative thing. Also, to make that possible, NATO has a single command structure with 28, I guess it is, of the 29. Maybe it's all 29 countries. Iceland doesn't have any military forces. First time ever in human history that's been done. Common standards. They buy the same kinds of things that work together. In fact, they've got to the point where individual militaries of the different NATO countries couldn't really go to war with one another. It's a fantastic achievement. That's all negative, but that's useful. Another thing is that the existence of NATO helps to buttress against things that are happening. In my judgment, Brexit is the stupidest thing Britain has done for centuries, well, certainly for ages. But people are going to live with it, in part because everybody's still in NATO, even though Britain is leaving the continent in just about every other way. But it's not leaving NATO. It's not that stupid. We can talk about that later if you want. Now, what are the positive aspects? Well, European countries put up a lot of military forces, a lot more than we do, incidentally. Now, a lot of them are not that effective, but they have more than 2 million men and women under arms. And they put up most of what is now needed as a deterrent force, a tripwire, whatever you want to call it, against Mr. Putin going beyond Ukraine. In fact, a good reason why he hasn't gone beyond Ukraine, except in indirect means like cyber and energy and that sort of thing, is because he knows there's NATO there. And that means the United States will be there. However much Mr. Trump has tried to cut out from under everybody the pillars of NATO. It's still there. Whether it would last another 4 years of his leadership, if that's the right word, well, it's another matter. People now talk about everybody has to share burdens more. Fine, let's have them share burdens more. The Europeans pay more. We've been fighting about that for almost half a century. Though it used to be said, and it can be said again today, that a lot of these countries, if it does push come to shove, we have a war, they provide the battlefield, not us, not us. In fact, 10 of the 29 now meet the 2% goal, which was a poison chalice anyway. With regard to Europe, we don't. If you take the amount of American force that's actually committed to Europe, it's less than 1%. In fact, also, if Germany went to 2%, which we're pushing to do, all holy hell would break loose. Nobody wants that. Germany, the most important military power in Europe, everybody would be heading for the hills. Got to watch out what you wish for. NATO, I've already indicated a limit to how far Mr. Putin can probe. Also, being in NATO helps with a lot of things. 9/11, all of our NATO allies came and helped us out. They sent NATO airborne warning planes to the United States. All of them sent people to Afghanistan, not because they were worried about the Taliban coming to Europe. They did it because they were worried America might lose interest in Europe. And here's a little cottage secret, okay? The only country that can deal effectively with Russia, certainly in Europe, is the United States. Nobody else can. No other coalition can. So they went to Afghanistan to keep us pinned to Europe. And similarly, after the misbegotten war in Iraq, they did a similar thing. The Allies worked together with us on counterterrorism, well beyond what, yes, they have terrorism in Europe. We're more concerned about it, even though we've had less. The Europeans in NATO work on that. And one of the big things right now is cybersecurity. We gain an awful lot by what our European allies do. A lot of smart people there working through NATO. NATO is also a platform for the United States to project power. Let's remember, a lot of the world is based on power. We can talk about values, we can talk about everything else, but raw power still matters in every element of power, whether it's military, economic, or diplomacy, which we tend to give a short shrift to. It's also a transit platform to elsewhere. We want to get to the Middle East. How do we get there? We go through Europe. We go through NATO, and that's how we get it done. The American Air Force, incidentally, moved from Germany down to Italy in order to get to the Middle East. And at some point, we may get some more European help elsewhere, but because of NATO, otherwise no. And then a final point. We gain an awful lot of influence in Europe because we're in NATO. We get influence on trade. The American private sector knows this all the time. We help to shape the future of Europe. We help to gain all kinds of influence, which works for the United States everywhere in the world. We would be idiots if we didn't return to a positive contribution, and no questioning in Europe that we are committed, which is the way it is today. The US commitment to Europe, to NATO in particular, buys us a heck of a lot of influence. And let's get back to where we should be, move forward with a transforming NATO. Thank you.
Robert, thank you. I think that has brought us forcefully into the view of the importance of NATO and given us a great basis for the further discussion. Now, if I can get Ambassador Donnelly to come up, we're going to remind everyone about just how wired and interwired we are with Europe on the economic front. Shaun, are you there?
I'm here. Let's see if someone can bring my picture up, or if that's okay. There we go. Thanks. Ron, Andrew, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here. I appreciate the Jefferson Foundation invitation. You know, I grew up in rural Indiana, and one of the towns that was about 20, 30 miles away was Monticello. I went to Monticello as a kid. Somehow they never figured out how to pronounce the word correctly. It's great to be at the real Monticello, and I hope that I can add a bit of the dismal science, but not make it too dismal. So what is this European Union that people talk about? And does the EU, does Europe still matter to the US? I agree with Bob Hunter. I'll cut to the chase. Of course it does. So I'm going to focus on the economic side of it, but just a few basic things. The European Union is about 450 million people, so significantly larger than the United States, a larger economy than the United States. Now, the European Union has changed. Those old timers among you will recall the history. Let me just do it very quickly. What has evolved into the European Union started back in 1951 as a modest little European coal and steel community. 6 member countries, still referred to as the Core 6, Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And it has expanded since 1951 through a variety of European Economic Community, European communities, the European Community, and then finally, since 2009, since the Lisbon Treaty, the European Union. It has grown beyond an economic organization, but its roots do remain economic. The EU matters. Together, the US and the European Union represent about 45% of the global economy, and we're about the same size. It's the European Union is the US's largest trade partner when you take the European Union nations together. About 18% of US exports, 22% of US imports. Total US trade with the European Union is about $1.2 trillion in the most recent years. But trade is really not the most important. Trade is dwarfed by the activities of US affiliates. This is Procter & Gamble factories in France and Germany and Luxembourg. This is Unilever plants in Ohio and California. This is BMW factories in South Carolina. The largest US automobile exporter isn't General Motors or Ford or Chrysler, it's BMW from its plant in South Carolina. Our economies are integrated. Investors feel very comfortable in Europe coming to the US. American companies feel comfortable investing in Europe, in part because of the rule of law. They know they're not going to get treated unfairly or expropriated. US investment in Europe dwarfs our investment in China. Much of the discussion of US trade and investment policy is, of course, focused on China these days. But if you dig into the numbers, Europe remains much more important. If you just talk to US businesses, about where they are making their money, where their jobs that are created in the US that come from trade and investment overseas, it still is focused on Europe, on the UK, which unfortunately, as Bob said, has made this ridiculous decision that to leave the European Union. But so be it. I think the last data I had that there were about 4.5 million Europeans working for American companies in Europe. And there were almost as many, about 4.1, 4.2 million Americans were working in the US for European headquartered companies. This is a true partnership. It's a win-win relationship. Just ask US companies what really matters to them. If you look at the stock, that's all the investment over time, not what's flown in just the last year. But the stock of US investment in our foreign partners overseas, China isn't even in the top 25. About 15, 16 of the countries on that list, the largest places we still have the most invested, still dominated by European Union companies. Now, do we all just sing happily together? No. I mean, we're competitors. That's kind of how free market economies work. And when we compete, we get into some disputes. In the earliest days of the European market, the common market as it was called back in the 50s and 60s, we got into a chicken war with Europe. Europe didn't want our chickens. We are still arguing about chickens, whether they're frozen, whether they're rinsed in water or in chlorine. We have, unfortunately, but I would argue almost inevitably, a large number of disputes with Europe. Many of them are based in agricultural products. Every country in the world that I know of does a pretty good job, unfortunately, of trying to protect its agricultural interests, the US included, through subsidies. Most of our real disputes with Europe tend to be over agriculture. Europe won't take our genetically modified corn and soybeans, although they've been, in my view, proven to be safe. It's a political issue. Hormone beef, chicken, wine. Europe has this so-called geographical indicators that not only does champagne have to come from Champagne, but I guess Frankfurters have to come from Frankfurt. We're a country of immigrants, and we brought our cheeses and meats and stuff with us from Europe, and we think we should be able to use those names. But the big picture, this represents a small portion of our trading relation with Europe. A couple of the most recent disputes that tend to get some headlines, at least if you look on the business pages, Boeing and Airbus, the two big global competitors for commercial aircraft, at least until the Chinese squeeze into that space. And it's almost inevitable. Europe is much more comfortable subsidizing things than we are. But I wouldn't get absorbed by the disputes. Don't ignore the 96, 98% of our trade and our investment that goes back and forth smoothly and without disputes. But sometimes I find a tendency to people in the US and in Europe to think, well, Americans are just like Europeans. We're partners, therefore everything is the same. There are differences, and I would, in the economic space, Europeans are much more comfortable, I would argue, having a bigger government role in the economy. They're having their banks, their airlines, their all these state-owned enterprises, railroads, and so on. We sort of, as Americans, think, whether this is rational or not, these ought to be run as private enterprises. Europeans are much more comfortable having the government regulate things. In the US, standards are developed through a very complex system with multi-stakeholders, academics, business, labor, consumers, and the government kind of blesses the system through the American National Standards Organization. Europe is much more top-down government standards, and I would argue Europe has set out to use standards as an element in their industrial competitiveness strategy. They've decided a much more welfare state, higher benefits for people, unemployment and otherwise. And one of the ways they can do that is to try and keep out more foreign competitors. And one of the ways they do that is by dominating and frankly twisting standard system. We could talk about that forever. One other example is privacy. A lot of issue these days about data privacy. And I think if you look, Europeans seem quite comfortable. I'm, simplifying this, but Europeans are quite comfortable having the government have access to their data, but they're very worried about private companies, whether that's Google or banks or something, having access to that data. Whereas we as Americans seem more comfortable. We provide our credit data and so on to all kinds of private players, but don't let the government start to do that. So some would say we're brothers and sisters with our European friends economically. I would argue it's more we're more like cousins. There's a little bit more distance in terms of how we do some of those things. One final point I just want to make. Beyond our bilateral economic relationship, another reason Europe matters a lot to us, we need to work much more with Europe to provide coordinated, sound economic leadership for the global economy. When the US and Europe spend our time fighting about economic issues, it opens up for China and India opportunities to make mischief. leadership, coordinating, reforming the World Bank, reforming the Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the global trade rules. I would argue too much of our time recently has spent with Europeans and Americans fighting with each other instead of together trying to come up with a shared agenda that we can move forward there. So again, I guess I'll end up where I started. Some people seem to think that the US and Europe are siblings, are brothers and sisters. Economically, I think we're more like cousins, but we ought to be closer cousins. We got to find a way to work together. Some of that will depend, in my view, on how things go in our election coming up on November 3rd. But there's a challenge out there to us as Americans, American officials, leaders, to try to get this economic partnership to the higher level where it ought to be. I think it can be done, but yes, Europe still matters a great deal to us economically. Thanks.
Shaun, that's great. Thank you. We have plenty of time now for questions, and I think that's good. We've got one that goes to Ambassador Hunter to start us off with, and it's a two-part. It's, did the Clinton administration make a mistake by inviting Poland to join NATO? And shouldn't Poland be a buffer between NATO and Russia?
Two questions. Number one, Poland, I guess the whole reason for raising the Poland question right now is they aren't such a great democratic state the way we'd hoped they would be. You could have said Hungary at the same time, which led the way. One of the things that NATO and the European Union ought to have an ability to do is to get into both Warsaw and to Budapest and pound on these people a lot harder than they're doing. But Poland was brought into NATO along with the Czech Republic and also Hungary in the first round for a couple of very simple geopolitical reasons. Number one, they surrounded Germany. At the end of the Cold War, Germany became unified, actually for the first time ever. The Russians accepted that. But they also had another thing, and people don't remember this. The Russians accepted that a unified Germany would be in NATO, where the United States could watch over it, because look what happened in what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, where they lost 27 million people. We can't even fathom that number. Then when it came time to talking about enlargement, and we in the West decided we'd start with Poland and the Czech Republic, with Hungary thrown in. The Germans wanted that to surround themselves to quiet everybody's worries, and the Russians accepted it. The Russians have not liked further expansions to the Baltic states and to a lot of the others that we brought in. In fact, there's some people now talking about bringing in Georgia, which would be a terrible mistake. Among other things, basic rule of NATO: every member must be prepared to defend every other member against foreign aggression. And if you're not prepared to do that, nobody should be, a country shouldn't be a member. Frankly, there's no country in NATO that's prepared to defend Georgia. That would be dumb. That's just an anti-Russian move by people who don't know any better. You can't just be anti-Russia and expect them not to respond. Well, we should be remonstrating with the Poles, but we're not doing that. Now, the other part of the question was, should be a buffer state. Buffer states are rejected by everybody except maybe the Russians. Nobody wants to be considered, I'm in the middle and I can be pulled this way or pulled that way. The Ukrainians didn't like it. And incidentally, when it came to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our hands were not clean. The Russians were mistakenly trying to pull Ukraine in its direction. We were trying to pull it in our direction. It's all on the public record. You can see it. The Assistant Secretary of State was trying to run a coup in our direction in Kiev. The Russians intercepted the phone calls on the internet. Look it up. That helped produce the invasion of Ukraine. Nobody wants to be a buffer. And frankly, if we're going to try to implement George H.W. Bush's brilliant grand strategy, Europe, whole, and peace, whole and free and at peace, which means a role for Russia as well, then you got to be very careful on what you do on that. Buffer state, oh no, nobody wants that.
Let me, first of all, remind the audience that you can ask questions, put them into the Q&A function, type them in. I think you're all literate out there, so please go right ahead. And we will try to get to as many as we can. I have a question for Ambassador Donnelly. To what extent are there opportunities for the US and Europe to work together to provide investment opportunities for developing countries to compete with and provide an alternative to Chinese efforts?
Well, thanks. That's an interesting question, and you can slice it different ways. I mean, China is a global player. China is investing in Europe, investing in the United States, investing in developing countries around the world. And with a lot, these aren't just, with all respect, these aren't just Chinese private companies. The Chinese government is actively involved one way or another in these things. So yes, there are opportunities. And one of the advantages, I would argue, for US-Europe partnerships, if we're trying to do ventures, say, in a third country in the developing world, whether that's Egypt or South Africa or Brazil or something, these are big markets and big investment opportunities there. American companies are used to working with European companies. European companies are used to working with American companies. There's a lot of competition, but there's also a lot of complementarity, and American companies are comfortable going to their board saying, we want to partner in this venture with an Italian or a German company or something like that. So yes, and they can bring different strengths. Maybe one has the technology, one has the financing. Maybe this venture in Brazil or Egypt is going to be trying to market to the world, and having a European partner and an American partner can help them to touch different kinds of things. So a lot of that can be done by the European and American private sectors. Most countries in the world are actively seeking investment. They seek it from China. They seek it from Europe and the United States. Now, particularly in the Trump administration, there's been a very active effort, and I do not disagree with this, to go around the world warning particularly developing countries about some of the potential downfalls of getting too locked in with Chinese partnerships and investors. Sri Lanka, where I happen to have served as ambassador, is exhibit A in this, in terms of having some Chinese partnerships to build and run ports, and all of a sudden China forecloses on loans, and Sri Lanka is now kind of getting squeezed by the Chinese. So I think there are some opportunities, and when Europe and the United States are working together, we have a better chance of succeeding in succeeding economically, but also dealing with the challenge, and it is a real challenge, of China out there subsidizing their projects. Also, frankly, the Chinese seem much more comfortable with some illicit payments to government ministers and so on like that. So it is important that European and American governments, but also European and American companies, get out there and cooperate in combating the Chinese competition.
I have to remember to unmute here. Thank you, Shaun. I have a question now, which really goes to all three panelists. And the question is, what do you see as the key opportunities as far as policy areas for diplomatic gains with Europe and Russia going forward? That is, can better diplomatic relations with both be accomplished at the same time, or is there an inherent tension between focusing on Europe and focusing on NATO and Russia? And I'd like Pamela, if I might, to start with this question. Are there things we can do together with Europe and Russia, win-win for everybody? Or are we inherently in a position of tension? Or perhaps one could add the third part, do we have to do both all at the same time?
Well, thanks for the question. I think it's a good one. And I would say I would lean more toward the last part. I mean, the relationship with Russia is always going to be complicated. You know, just going back to Robert Hunter's discussion of buffer states and, the fact that nobody wants to be one, and his statement that there is a place for Russia in this conception that we have of Europe, I think there's a clash, because Russia's sense of itself as a great power means that it wants to be seen as an equal, not some part of a palette. And it also has a view that that buffer states are just fine, if they're in Russia's sphere of influence. Notwithstanding some of these sort of basic foundational differences between Europe, the United States, and Russia, I do think there are areas of cooperation. I do think, especially when it's not something that's touching a specific sensitive point like Georgia and NATO or something like that, that would be pretty much a non-starter. But on things like the pandemic, I mean, that's a natural area for, should have been a natural area for cooperation among all the states. Russia has great technology, wonderful scientists, so does Europe. The United States, there's no reason why we aren't seeing more cooperation there. Cooperation in some aspects of space, I think that might be possible, especially if it stays demilitarized. Highly technical areas of the world, all three. So I think if we could focus on the strengths of the United States, of Russia, and of Europe, yes, there would be opportunities for cooperation. But too often we have to deal with these very sensitive points of difference that become barriers that we simply can't get past. So until situations like Ukraine are resolved, I think there's just a level of mistrust that's so high on the part of the Russians, and frankly on our part, that I think it would be very difficult to find areas of cooperation. But there are plenty of places where the strengths of all three could come together and be a support for not just those areas, Russia, the United States, and Europe, but for the whole world. So it's a terrible shame that all of this is keeping us from the kind of cooperation that would be possible. That goes back to what I said earlier about the Secretary General's speech of wanting to see the most powerful countries in the world cooperate more. There are plenty of opportunities to do it, but we have to overcome our basic differences geopolitically and in terms of power, as Robert Hunter mentioned, in order for that to happen. And too often we just can't get there.
Pamela, thank you. Robert, let me let you pick up next and then see what Shaun would like to add. There's certainly the economic area beckons one, hopefully.
Well, first, I agree with Pamela. That makes things easy. The fact is, we're going to have to live with Russia. They have to live with us, which means that we really should try to find ways to maximize ways in which we can work together, or at least not work in ways that could lead us to a clash in places where, in ways that just don't make any sense for anybody. We do not have a huge ideological competition with Russia in terms of different ways of living that we had with the Soviet Union. We have more of an ideological competition with China, which has its own worldview. Hopefully we're not going to, the two sides going to be so stupid as to get into a Cold War with China, and certainly not with Russia. I seek areas of cooperation. One that hasn't been mentioned is in the Arctic. There are some people now who say, oh yes, there's going to be a fundamental military confrontation in the Arctic. Actually, there's an awful lot of cooperation there that goes on. And the people who support it in the United States government are the United States Coast Guard, that understands the tremendous value if we're able to continue working in the Arctic, where we do depend upon one another and work quite successfully. Arms control. The current administration has committed itself, as has Mr. Putin, to try to renew New START, which comes up next year. A whole series of areas. Now, when one says Europe in this context, you got to be very careful. You've got to remember that there are 27 sovereign European countries in NATO, plus us and Canada, and each has its own interests. The fact that we can work together on anything is one of God's little miracles. There are countries in the western part of Europe who don't see a problem with working with Russia. Italy's one, for example. They'd like to be able to do it all the time. But if you go to the Baltic states, Poland, and a couple of others, they say, oh no, we can't possibly deal with the Russians because here they come again. So you're not going to be able to get a coordinated view there. But if the United States is back in there and is testing the Russians all the time, keeping a dialogue open, and trying to find ways with Russia, if they're prepared to do it, then we have a chance. Russia, let's understand, despite its global aspirations, is really a regional country. It's small beer compared to China. And it's never going to be a superpower again. Doesn't have the population, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the economic base, doesn't have the educational system, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be a major power, but it's not going to be a superpower. And if we were smart, if we could stop worrying about, is Russia going to steal our election and all this kind of stuff? It's like, if you believe that Russian interference is going to cause our election to go one way or another, or it happened in 2016, then you don't believe in American democracy. We're not stupid, we the American people.
I devoutly hope you're proved correct. But I think probably your good chances are good. So, Shaun, anywhere you'd like to go with the last one?
I just want to pick up on what Bob was saying. And certainly, if you went to American companies today and said, what are the top 5, 6 countries around the world where you want to try to develop more? Russia would show up on that list almost not at all. It is not a major player in the global economy. Could US and Europe try to work together with a serious Russian government interested in reform to try and help, create some economic opportunities to invest? But as long as we have this sort of regime in Russia, I think chances of that are limited. But I'd like to sort of turn the question, if I may, more to China, because I think China is the threat out there in the global thing. And this is where if the US and Europe could cooperate on a serious agenda in the World Trade Organization to try and get real disciplines on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and so on. And the perception Americans have is that Europe in the World Trade Organization, the EU and most of its member countries, have tended to hide behind America's skirts. And we're out there pounding on. Now, has the Trump administration been doing it in the most adept way? I would say not. But still, the US has been, through various administrations, trying to help put more pressure on China through the World Trade Organization. And the perception is Europe hasn't stepped up and really worked with us, that they want to try to keep good relations with China and let the Americans be the bad cowboy on that. Now, Europeans would probably say America is too aggressive, unilateral, cowboy out there, and so on. But it's an example where in things like curbing these industrial subsidies, more international, real rules about transparency and anti-corruption. That's a tool that China uses a lot, not anti-corruption, but corruption. And so if the US and Europe can work together globally to get stronger rules and some sense of enforcement, but in the global economic area, it's really China that would be the focus. Russia is just not a player, in my view.
I wouldn't disagree. I think that, what I was talking about was Russia's self-perception as a global power.
Absolutely.
Not it's the reality of how much power they have. Right. But I would say that we have to be careful in the way that we talk to and about Russia, because that sense of dismissing them is part of, I think, what challenges our ability to work better with them. So, they're not dumb. They know that China is an emerging power, and even as in places like Venezuela, where they want to kind of stick a finger in our eye, they can't do it without China's help. So they know that Russia is not the kind of power that the Soviet Union was.
But showing respect is
showing
cheap.
respect is very important.
No, true.
You're muted,
Ron.
You're muted.
All right. I think that's a great point to make about diplomacy in general. And it underlies a lot of what we're talking about, this need to show respect and to listen to others, which has nothing to do with doing what they want. It has everything to do with shaping our message and our approach to get them to do what we want. And I think we're going to pivot to another question now. We've got time for another one. But I wanted to note a theme that comes up in a sense in several of these answers. sometimes in American discussions, you'll hear people say, you'll see people write that we have to get our priorities in order, which suggests that we can do this, that we have one priority and it trumps another priority inevitably. And yet what you're hearing here is how so much of the business of both policy making and diplomacy, which is how you get policy results, is about managing multiple priorities so that they don't get in each other's way, and so that you can do multiple things at one time. And at any given moment, one may have a somewhat higher priority than another one, but the task of diplomacy is actually to manage multiple interests rather than to have some rigid prioritization. And that goes very much to our next question, which is also to all three panelists. And it's about the pivot to Asia. And does a focus on Asia lead to a decline in the importance of Europe for American foreign policy? What are the implications of the pivot to Asia? And I think that has multiple parts, which we can go at any way you want, but there's the intellectual part. If you're pivoting, are you able to walk and chew gum at the same time? Can you think about another issue? There's a resource issue. And so I'm going to ask all three of the panelists, and I think just arbitrarily, I'm going to start with Ambassador Donnelly, but for no particularly good reason, and that I just thought I shouldn't always start with the same person.
Well, thanks, Ron. And I mean, I guess beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but we certainly should be able to walk and chew gum and at the same time. And I think that's what lies behind I think it's identified most clearly with the Obama administration, with this pivot to Asia, was not so much that Europe wasn't important, but that we had not been paying enough attention to Asia, not just to China and Japan and Korea, but other countries in the region, Malaysia, Indonesia, et cetera. And I think that, personally, I think that was a valid criticism. If you went over the last 20, 30 years and looked at the number of presidential visits and Secretary of State visits and so on like that. So, but there are limited resources. There's a certain amount of time and presidential time and cabinet time that one can devote. But I think we should be able, we're a global country, and we should be able to be creative enough to find ways to do what we need to do with Europe and what we need to do with Asia. And by the way, there are other parts of the world that are also important. We can't be unilateral in sort of that our foreign policy is identified with our North Atlantic policy, full stop. We have to be able to balance and move around the different theaters of the world. And I think just if you look at the economic data and where the world economy is going, paying more attention to Asia makes sense in our national interest, but that's not to disrespect Europe.
Robert, would you like to jump in on this one?
Sure thing. When President Obama got stuck with that metaphor of a pivot to Asia, he realized that was a mistake. He said, look, I'm a basketball player, and pivot means you plant one foot, and that's in the North Atlantic, and then you move towards Asia. He also said, and I think this is common sense, if we're going to do anything anywhere in the world, we're better off doing it with strong partnerships with Northern Europe and Western Europe than if we try to do it alone. That's just common sense. Frankly, we are the richest country in the world, the richest country that's ever existed. And if we can't chew all packs of gum and walk and shoot basketball and that sort of thing all at the same time, like one of those Indian guys who got 8 arms, we're just not doing things right. And incidentally, it's something we haven't even mentioned here. One thing we have to start with as a base is the resuscitation of things here at home. It's not just infrastructure in the economy, it's also the massive transformation that's involved now in American society. One of the things, of course, is going to be the results of COVID, which is going to affect everybody in the ways nobody understands. But finally, we're bringing back to the floor the question that has haunted this country for centuries, which is the question of race. Black Lives Matter. I hope to God that issue does not go away once again. I worked in the Johnson White House in 1964 when we did all kinds of stuff, part of which was related to trying to help give opportunity to Black Americans. Then we forgot about it. It's come back again. We are going to have to deal with the issues of inclusion and equality in the realest sense in our country here, or we're not going to be worth very much in the outside world. You can't be a sitter on the hill if you don't build your Monticello and then work with it. One of the things, however, it's my shtick, is we have to learn how to integrate different parts of power and influence, the military, the economic, and the diplomatic, which has been given short shrift. We need to be able to relate apples to oranges, whether it's Europe or the Middle East or cyber or space or whatever it is, at the same time. There are people who can do it, but we tend not to bring them into government. And our poor diplomats at the State Department are asked to make up for the failures of strategic thinking, which really has to emanate from the White House. And if Mr. Biden wins, he's going to have to bring in people to do that. If Mr. Trump wins, he's got to finally say, hey, I'm going to have a legacy here. I better get some people who can do this and stop just being a bomb thrower. These are critical 4 years for the United States redefining its role in the world, in which we can still be a leader, but much more of a normal country where we're no longer the superpower of the country calling all the shots.
Pamela, I suspect that we somehow probably still left a little space for you to comment on this question.
I actually would like to take it in a slightly different direction, agreeing with what Robert and Shaun have already said. But for me, the question is a pivot to what? When we're talking about Europe, as Shaun said, we're talking about cousins, right? We're talking about people who are familiar with us. He talked about European firms being comfortable doing business in the United States and vice versa. I would say that things are changing in Asia, and we're certainly learning about doing business there. But we're talking about a completely different culture. And we're also talking about a rising power in the case of China. And so the pivot is filled with a sense of seeking opportunity, but there's also a bit of suspicion and a desire to try to compete or even suppress what we see as a rival. We hear this and talk about China going to Africa, for example, and taking everything over, and isn't it terrible? But then you ask, okay, well, who else is providing those kinds of resources to Africa? So for me, what we have to think about, in addition to what we've heard before, is what is it that we hope to get out of this pivot? Because if the idea is that we're going to fight so that we can beat China, quote unquote, then I don't think that it's going to end up being a source of opportunity for really either side. And we're likely to just run into more and more competition that could be counterproductive. So as the more powerful country, as Robert has said, I think we have to think carefully about what it is that we want to do. And again, I go back to what kind of rhetoric are we using? Because we're not talking about our cousins. We're talking about a culture where we've had our own history of prejudice against people. Right now, we're having our struggles with them, with the pandemic and the way we refer to them. So I think we have to think there are plenty of opportunities, and we can certainly handle this, walk and chew gum at the same time, of course. But I do think that we have to be careful about what we're pivoting to, what we're pivoting for, and think about the different areas. Is the pivot to Asia that we make in the security context, where we already have established relationships with Japan and some of the others, the same as our pivot that would be more economic? So I think it's a complex question of how we actually manage this. Certainly we can do it, but it has to be done with a lot of care and thought about what are our ends in making this pivot.
Can I add one word to that? There are three of you out there who are career ambassadors. We also have Charles Rivkin, who is an ambassador. For those of you who are thinking about a career, it's not just learning our history. Anytime you go into another country, the first thing you have to learn is what's their view of their history and what is their culture. Because if you don't understand something about their culture, you're going to get left at the bus stop.
Thanks. I think we have about run to the point where we're supposed to wrap this up. I think this last discussion of walking, chewing gum, doing multiple things at one time, it brings up a very interesting point about the whole need for both clear policy and competent diplomacy. That nobody can do all of this simultaneously by themselves. And so this is why one needs the whole structure of diplomacy and a competent State Department in order to be able to do multiple things at the same time. In order for that structure to work and for your diplomats overseas to discharge the policy, to make use of understanding the foreigners, they have to have some clarity in what they're supposed to be doing, and the policies have to actually remain in place for a bit of time. Now, there are always going to be areas around the edges where things will bump into each other. But if you don't have some basic direction that stays fairly clear, and if you don't have an ability to use very competent people in a lot of parts of the world and a lot of parts of your bureaucracy, you cannot possibly operate. Then you will not be able to walk and chew gum. On that note, Andrew, are you still with us? Because I think we need some instruction. We're going to try this idea of breaking for lunch and actually having an audience when we come back.
Yes, so we're just breaking for lunch for half an hour. That's from 11:45 to 12:15. And then we'll resume to hear our keynote lecture by Charles Rivkin.
We devoutly hope to see you all back.
Yes.
Good.
That'll be the highlight. So stay.
All right, I think we're back. And Andrew, are you there? Just doing a quick check.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, I am.
And Ambassador Rifkin is there. All right. And actually, we have most of our audience, to my vast surprise, but pleasure. So we're back, and we have a great pleasure in introducing Ambassador Rifkin, who will be our keynote speaker, because he brings multiple dimensions to this as a businessman, as ambassador to France, as the head of the Economic and Business Bureau in the State Department, and now as the head of the Motion Picture Association. I know the name changed in 19. Did I get that right? Which is a major trade association of the United States. So he's got actually more potential ways of approaching this subject than most of us have. But he also was telling us earlier in some conversations that when he was ambassador to France, he also had a particular connection to Thomas Jefferson. So his full bio is in your program. So with that, Ambassador Rifkin, Charlie, take it away.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Newman. And, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I want to extend a special appreciation to the Academy and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation for sponsoring this fantastic conference. And, it's more than an honor for me to be a part of the American Academy of Diplomacy, because not only has diplomacy been sort of a higher calling for me personally, but it's something of a family affair. When I was 6 years old, my family created the William R. Rivkin Award at the State Department with the help of my godfather, Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And the award is named after my late father, and it's given to mid-level Foreign Service officers who exhibit intellectual courage and constructive dissent. And every year since 1968, my family and I have been proud to present an award that encourages all voices to be heard so that our foreign policy can better reflect who we are and what we truly stand for. So I speak to you today unabashedly as a deep believer in diplomacy and a lifelong friend of Europe who, as a child, lived with my family in Luxembourg, where my dad was ambassador. And then as a young student, I lived and studied for a year with a French family in Brittany. And later in my professional career, I was privileged to serve as the US ambassador to France and Monaco. And then as Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, as the ambassador said. And now in my current capacity as chairman and CEO of the Motion Picture Association, which is one of America's most export-oriented industries, I continue to recognize Europe as an enduring friend and partner. So in all these chapters of my life and career, I have long appreciated and recognized the deep and enduring value of our shared history with Europe, as well as our essential diplomatic, military, cultural, and business ties. So my response to the central question we're discussing at this conference, does Europe matter to America, will surprise no one. That answer has always been an emphatic yes. So today, I want to touch upon some of those experiences as I talk about this deeply important relationship and why it matters to our mutual future, and just share a few passing thoughts too on Thomas Jefferson, who was, after all, one of our first envoys to France when our country and our relationship with France and all of Europe was in its infancy. So I'd like to start, if I may, with a few experiences during my 4.5 years as ambassador to France, where I came to viscerally understand the deep connection between America and our oldest ally. So the first anecdote has me jumping out of a plane over the fields of Normandy. But before you think I'm indulging in some self-serving heroic anecdote, let me hasten to correct you. I'm deeply scared of heights, and I was very, very terrified during this experience. But in 2012, my defense attaché at Embassy Paris asked me to join about 150 American and French veterans in what I'm told was the first ever parachute jump by a sitting US ambassador to France. And we actually jumped from 12,000 feet to commemorate the anniversary of the D-Day landings. And we were marking the date in 1944, of course, when American and Allied paratroopers descended at night in the area around Saint-Mère-Église in Normandy. It was a safely staged exercise in which a member of the elite US Army's Golden Knights parachute team was literally attached to me as I made the jump. But I got to admit, I felt some trepidation landing in front of a crowd of 25,000 people in live French television, especially because I actually neglected to run this by the State Department or the White House for their approval. And with the cloudy skies and 25-mile-an-hour winds that day, a lot could have gone wrong in a very public way, but it was okay. Because I knew that this jump paled in comparison to what those brave men had endured exactly 68 years ago that day, hanging in the darkness and facing enemy fire. And so as the orchards and hedgerows of Saint-Mère-Église came up to meet me, I could actually close my eyes and think about how so many things had changed in those 7 decades, at least in the most obvious ways, but how so little had changed in terms of what truly mattered, namely our enduring friendship. As ambassador, I got that same powerful sense of historical unity every Memorial Day when I attended a ceremony at Belleau Wood near the Marne River outside of Paris. The United States Marines consider this place, as many of you know, to be sacred ground because it's where during World War I, they advanced in the face of overwhelming gunfire, and the US forces suffered thousands of casualties while charging and ultimately overwhelming the German machine gun nests. But by doing so, they saved the city of Paris, and for their incredible bravery, they forever earned the nickname Devil Dogs. And I remember one year when the commandant of the US Marine Corps delivered a speech, and he said something that has always stayed with me. He said that even though 10,000 Americans died on this very field, this very battleground, it was but a small piece of an unrepayable debt that the United States owes France for their part in the creation of America. And those words, delivered by a proud US Marine so many years later, said a lot about American history, but it also spoke a lot about our enduring bond with our European allies. And as we gather here at Monticello, albeit virtually, and we celebrate the life and ideas of Thomas Jefferson, the value and effectiveness of diplomacy, and the relationship between the US and Europe, I believe we have to consider these questions. How do we ensure that our shared history continues to mean something? How do we keep that unity vibrant and alive? And how do we leverage that unity to address some of the most daunting challenges in recent memory? There could not be a more important time to consider these questions, for we are indeed at a crossroads. A recent Pew Research Center survey of 14 advanced economies this year found America's standing to be at or near record lows compared to studies in recent decades. This survey included 9 European countries, and in France alone, favorable views of the United States had plummeted from 62% in the year 2000 to exactly half of that, 31% today. Clearly, there's work to be done. So I want to offer some thoughts and perspectives about how we can begin to address these problems based on my time in both the public and the private sectors. And as I thought about what I wanted to share with you today, I remembered a collection of letters sent by Jefferson himself to his consul general in Marseille in the year 1788. Now, when I served in Paris, the descendant of that consul general, whose family had kept and handed down these unpublished letters over generations, wanted to share them with me. And I read all of them, and it was inspiring to see these letters penned in Jefferson's own distinctive hand. And they spoke to his active involvement in the kind of diplomacy and commerce that has continued between the United States and Europe now for centuries. He wrote about a shipment of whale oil to America. He asked that a cargo of trees bound for Monticello avoid a stopover in Boston in winter where they might suffer blights from the cold weather. He spoke of the probability of continued peace between France and Great Britain. And I was pretty amused to read in 1788 as well that America's minister plenipotentiary considered the King of Great Britain, in Jefferson's own words, to be decidedly lunatic. But what a time that must have been, to walk the boulevards of Paris in 1788 and have people ask his opinions about human and individual rights. And these are big ideas, still in their infancy, shared with a people who were also experiencing a revolution of their own. It was a natural fit. 2 nations sharing the dream of building despite all their imperfections, a new nation based on human rights. But as Jefferson once observed, the way to heaven has always been said to be strewed with thorns. And inevitably, there would be those occasions when he needed to address difficult matters with his allies. And when that happened, Jefferson liked to repair to his residence and invite guests over for what he called family dinners. As one historian noted, these meetings would always involve, quote, a well-spread table, always open and generally filled, where food would be served first, followed by what was described as a humanizing influence of plentiful wine. And that was when Jefferson would speak to them of such constitutional matters facing the National Assembly at that time as whether the king should have a veto, or if the republic should allow hereditary legislatures, etc. This was diplomacy at its most intimate, and it's best because there were three important things working together. First of all, the credibility of the United States was at its highest. Second, the idea of community was important to everyone. In fact, Alexis de Tocqueville would later describe that sense of community as one of America's, quote, habits of the heart, which he considered to include family life, religious convictions, and participation in local politics. And the third element of these Jefferson sit-downs was common purpose. Well, I believe if Thomas Jefferson were joining us today, assuming he could get his head around this Zoom thing, he'd agree that these three elements are demonstrably lacking in so much of our interactions today between people, between nations, and between the United States and Europe. At the very moment when the world should be cooperating across the Atlantic and around the globe to tackle such issues as the coronavirus and any number of environmental, civic, and democratic challenges, facts and science are being challenged from all sides. Political disputes over the most fundamental questions of what's right or wrong are severely undercutting our ability to come to any kind of democratic domestic consensus. And it doesn't help matters at all that nation states have weaponized social media in ways that obscure the truth of global challenges. In August, the German Marshall Fund reported that authoritarian regimes have spent more than $300 million over the past decade to interfere in political processes in dozens of other countries. The report finds that this malign finance, as it's called, is heavily targeted against the US and Europe. They want to deny us the shared truth that underpins domestic governance and international cooperation. In the words of Kathleen Hicks, who's director of the International Security Program at CSIS, she says, America's deep divisions are a major strategic weakness. A strategic weakness, that is, because these divisions are challenging our very ability to work with our friends, allies, and adversaries abroad. As Hicks points out, this also has implications for America's cultural appeal, a concern that is as troubling for American cultural industries as it is for America's diplomats, since it impacts soft power. There's a powerful new Netflix documentary some of you may have seen called The Social Dilemma, and it outlines one source of division. As the filmmakers see it, social media companies are mining and manipulating our attention, our basic information, and our behavior. And like the fairy tale character Rumpelstiltskin, they're weaving it into gold to sell to advertisers. Instead of being the empowered and active users we like to think we are, this film tells us that we have in fact become the commodity. This commoditization is only one of the many dangers we face on the internet, including hate speech, terrorist content, counterfeit drugs, child pornography. And those abuses also include pernicious online piracy, which is an existential threat to my industry in particular. I'll give you an example. In 2018, the US government and the European Commission both published reports critical of the world's biggest pirate cyber locker, which goes by the name of Open Load. It took the Motion Picture Association 2 years of investigation to finally shut down that site, because the pirates are now using the same tools of fraud and deception that are used by money launderers and election meddlers. And they were not in some faraway corner of the globe. They were operating from the heart of Western Europe, which is just one small reminder that not all threats to the rule of law are external. At the time when we and our partners around the world need to construct diplomatic solutions and strengthen the rule of law, it's heartening to see that we share the latter value. And this is one of the baseline values that is essential to resetting our transatlantic consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, if we ignore or diminish our relationship with Europe, it will be at our own peril. In the case of my industry, the film, TV, and streaming content industry, for example, the European Union is increasingly asserting global leadership on policy issues that affect our mutual future. We simply cannot afford to watch from the sidelines, detached and uninvolved. On the back of its perceived success with privacy regulation and driven by the perception that the US is simply not restraining its digital giants, the EU is now turning to regulation of digital services. It is examining regulation of artificial intelligence. It's revisiting taxation of online services. This European assertiveness could be positive in some ways and negative in others. Where you stand, as always, depends on where you sit. In the fight against online piracy, for example, the rest of the world is learning from approaches pioneered in Europe, including the legal process for blocking piracy websites, which was built in Europe and the UK and has been very, very effective. At the same time, I'm concerned that EU regulation of digital services could, ironically, result in weaker rules for online liability than Europe has in place today, which would clearly be a step, in our opinion, in the wrong direction. But whether increased assertiveness by European regulators and tax authorities proves positive or negative in particular cases, this much I know is certain. It will impact US companies. It will reflect an overall philosophy that is somewhat different and more interventionist from the way we do things in the United States. And it will influence policies of other governments around the world, as EU privacy regulation has already done. So do we currently have a real seat at the table as a trusted partner in a broader discussion with Europe about future regulation of the digital economy? You can be the judge, but certainly we should. But we must and can go further than regulatory dialogue. We must do more to reinforce our awareness and embrace of shared values around individual rights, representative democracy, and economic and environmental sustainability. We have to extend our efforts to forge consensus on other matters that affect all of us as well, such as the truth about climate change, or trusting again in our democratic institutions, or believing, for example, the findings of intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic about interference in our democratic process. In the past, we sometimes took such basic areas of agreement for granted, but no longer. We need to forge a new shared truth, a new transatlantic consensus that can underpin joint action. Building on that foundation, we can commit ourselves to working together to defend our shared values, and protecting the democratic process is a good place to start. I'm talking about the necessity of nations that fundamentally care about truth, justice, community, and the rule of law coming together to confront the broader vulnerabilities that have allowed and are still allowing our politics and our technology to become a tool for disinformation and division. Now, one way to do this is to return to the existing institutions and mechanisms designed for international cooperation, from joint diplomatic pressure to the work of groups like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to law enforcement cooperation, to put a stop to that. All democracy-loving nations should be working together to stop that. As Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, I led the Bureau directly involved with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, better known as TTIP. It was the kind of ambitious trade deal that, in my very biased opinion, would have opened markets on both sides of the Atlantic, created jobs, and raised standards from copyright protections to labor rights. Unfortunately, it did not come to pass, but more recently, US and EU trade negotiators did manage to secure a small tariff deal, which, among other things, reduced tariffs on Maine lobsters. It seems the days of Jefferson's whale oil have clearly gone through some changes. But It was the first negotiated reduction in duties between Europe and the United States in more than 2 decades. And the fact that they achieved this under a strained relationship shows that the machinery for discrete problem solving can still operate. And that's a good thing. Bilateral problem solving remains vitally necessary to navigate an endless array of regulatory headaches and sustain our massive trade relationship that was discussed earlier in that fantastic panel today. Looking ahead, however, small deals are not enough. Given the challenges we will face, a growing need to go beyond our US-European problem-solving efforts and find ways to stand together on a wide range of fundamental environmental, public health, economic, and democratic challenges. These ideas are just the beginning of what we could do together in a broader US-European partnership. But our first ambition must be to strengthen that mutual understanding that the surveys say has so badly waned, to begin to repair transatlantic and international cooperation to fight fake news by malignant foreign powers. We must first begin to repair our national relationship with the truth and begin to forge an alliance of truth with the international partners who share our democratic values. When it comes to credibility, I think that the key missing piece in almost every walk of our communal life, particularly on the internet, and at the risk of sounding as if I'm quoting directly from Alice in Wonderland, we can only do that by restoring the credibility of credibility. So let's start with diplomacy, the very level of communications between nations. And as I saw firsthand, both as ambassador and assistant secretary of state, diplomacy is an all hands, comprehensive engagement of people abroad on the part of a dedicated network of public servants, starting with the diplomats and locally engaged staff that we have in virtually every country, and supported by the equally dedicated FSOs and civil servants at Maine State. And I believe the events of the past year have continued to demonstrate some exceptionally fine examples of the career US diplomat as the consummate truth teller at home and abroad, as part of a dedicated and honorable US national security and foreign policy establishment. Yet in spite of the integrity of our amazing career Foreign Service officers, somewhere between those Jefferson family dinners and the extensive work that our dedicated Foreign Service and civil service officers do today, we nonetheless seem to have lost the confidence of our transatlantic partners. But I believe this is only a temporary condition. To rebuild trust and restore not only cooperation, but true partnership, we must all recommit ourselves to diplomacy's core values of honesty, integrity, and public service, not only in our official discourses, but in our own direct interpersonal dealings with friends, neighbors, and colleagues, in our dealings with one another as fellow citizens and fellow members of the planet, and most certainly in the relationship between the United States and Europe. When he finally left France to return to the United States, Jefferson told his French friends that he deeply regretted leaving, but welcomed the future and ongoing mission of, in his words, cementing the friendship between his own country and theirs. As he wrote to one of his correspondents, he said, "Be assured that to do this is the first wish of my heart." The problems facing our world today are too complex and too strong to face separately and divided. A close US-European partnership must be, can be, and I believe will be at the heart of everything we do moving forward. I'm sure that Mr. Jefferson would agree. Thank you.
Ambassador Rifkin, that was a great speech, great place to put us into a final discussion. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask you one before we go to the questions that are beginning to come in from the audience. And that is, as you look at building or rebuilding our relations with Europe, which is now multiple countries and multiple organizations, do we have a need to rebuild our own diplomatic and governmental structure, or to reorient it in some way to make, assuming we want this cooperation to work better, do we have our mechanisms correctly set?
Well, look, Ambassador, as you know, I'm in the private sector now. I'm not, in the government. I think any institution, government institution or private sector institution, can always and should always improve. The State Department needs to be nimble. It needs to react to things quickly. It needs to deal with the rapid change that's happening around the planet right now. And for that, you need the right people. You need to continue to recruit the best and the brightest. You need to, in my very biased opinion, bring back some of those extraordinary career foreign service officers who have left in recent years, and rebuild, in a way that better reflects the challenges of this new century. In my, again, biased opinion, I've always thought that economic policy is foreign policy. And I think that we can do better as an institution by marshaling, by building economic ties. When I was ambassador, you really, in some ways, are leading a sales group. You have the Foreign Commercial Service, you have the Agricultural Service, you have the Treasury Department, you have military and defense sales, but we aren't really very well coordinated, and certainly not as much as other countries, in advancing our economic interests. And when you tie nations together, economically, then everything else follows. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do, or I should say, the people that are working in the government have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. We have another question, and I'm going to give you the first crack at it, but I see that if Shaun Donnelly is around, we might see if he wants to add anything. And this is, what role does the WTO, the World Trade Organization, play in the future of the US-EU relationship?
Yeah, I am going to actually defer to Shaun Donnelly, because it's his area of expertise, and I think that his response would be a lot more impactful. Shaun, are you there?
I am. I'm not sure if my face will pop up, but I hope you can hear me. I guess I would, in an economist's answer. So let me start my video. Sorry. There we go. Sorry. The WTO is a necessary but not necessarily a sufficient condition. I think there's a lot that the U.S. and the EU can do together in their bilateral relationship, and setting global agendas outside of the WTO. There's a lot of work to be done there, including in some other international organizations that deal with things like intellectual property or anti-corruption. But I think it is essential that the U.S. and the EU work better in the WTO. Over the past 4 years, just to pick a time frame, I'm afraid much of the time at the WTO has been spent with the U.S. and Europe sparring. The U.S. government and the Trump administration has taken a very aggressive approach to WTO with the commendable goal of reform, but I personally would question some of their tactics, and the EU has not supported that, and a lot of our relations with the EU at the World Trade Organization have become very contentious, even on an issue like China or state-owned enterprises where we should be able to cooperate. We haven't, because we've disagreed so much about tactics and the way that our administration has approached the WTO. So I do think for a new administration, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, it's time to take a fresh look at how we are approaching the WTO. How can we make it work? Because it is, for better or worse, the place that sets the global trade rules. There are other organizations that deal with particular sectors, including intellectual property at the World Intellectual Property Organization. But the WTO is at the core, and we need to do a better job of working with Europe to set the agenda, particularly as it applies to these new digital sectors of the economy that didn't exist when the WTO was created back in the mid-90s. The internet really didn't exist. And so it's one of the reasons we had the US, and I think appropriately so, updated our NAFTA agreement with the new US Mexico-Canada agreement we desperately need to update the global trade rules at the WTO. Thanks.
Thanks. It's good to have the right expertise at hand. Ambassador Rifkin, going back to you, question here. You mentioned the difference in US and European approaches towards social media. Could you comment on the US administration's vocal critique of Europe taxing Google and Facebook?
Well, look, these platforms, I suppose platform is too broad of a term, but these large internet companies are under assault throughout the world, including the United States, as you saw the most recent filing against Google by the US government. I don't have a specific opinion about taxation for them, but I do think that you're going to continue to see this type of activity against these large internet players in the United States. There is a big discussion in America right now, as many of you guys know, about Section 230 of the CDA, and whether or not the immunity that was granted to internet companies when the internet was born has been abused, and whether or not the platforms that benefit from that immunity need to be more responsible in making sure that the bad content that I mentioned in my remarks isn't present on the internet. Yes, piracy is a small part of it, but it's the same side of the same equation. We need our giant internet companies to be more socially responsible in terms of helping improve the democratic process. Your specific question about taxation, it's just not something that I focus on. But a digital services tax, that is very concerning to me. If all of a sudden, all of my member companies are becoming direct-to-consumer players with Disney Plus and HBO Max and Peacock, and in addition to Netflix and Apple TV Plus and Amazon, Prime Video, and if Europe wants to double tax them by making them pay additional tax for being a digital delivery service, that's deeply unfair as far as we're concerned. I can't really speak to the taxation for Google and Facebook, but I can say the digital services tax in our case is really unfair.
Thanks. I have a question here which goes back to your time in Paris. And the question is shaped as to what extent did US business investors or marketers avoid contact with your embassy, and for what reason? And I suppose the flip side would be which kinds of business did come to the embassy for help?
Ambassador, something that's always bothered me is that not enough businesses understand the power of US embassies abroad as convening opportunities. We can bring the most powerful players in the entire country together for a reception, for a presentation, introduce them to major players and minor players in American business, but people don't think to ask us. And I wonder if the business community in general knows that, because the large players do know that, but many of the large players, you were talking about Google and Facebook and other the trillion-dollar American companies, they go right to the president of France. They don't need the embassy. They have direct relationships with the highest level of the government. Small and medium enterprises are the backbone of the American economy, and we can very much help them. When governors and senators come to post and advocate for the economy of their states, it's very impactful with the French. But those that know the resources that we have and know the benefit we can bring are happy to come and get this, free asset, not free, you're paying your taxes, but nonetheless, the benefit of the insight of an embassy and the connectivity of an embassy in advancing American industry. I don't know how we can get the word out better, but it's just not known by most of the SMEs that I've met.
Yeah, I find often companies think of the embassy once they're in trouble, but not when they're trying to get into the market.
It's fun in the media business. I wasn't in the media business when I served as ambassador, but movies are, I think, in my mind, a wonderful diplomatic opportunity to discuss important issues. And so we would do screenings, and then we'd have big, important, debates about the topic of the films. But we use the embassy to convene the smartest people in the country, the leaders of the economy, and have intelligent discussions around the table. There's so many different ways you can convene. And I think our embassies do a great job. I'm in touch with at least a dozen of President Trump's ambassadors. And they're really trying their best, I think, to use the embassy as a tool to advance American economic interests.
Well, this is an example of new technology with not an old, but a tool fairly well established. Years ago, in the black ages before interconnectivity, we used to get boxes of film rolls, which were sent around usually by the defense attaché's office. And in fact, I can remember screening those films on our projector, which we had to learn to operate exactly as you've said. Although once I remember screening Dr. Zhivago around the swimming pool, and in the winter scene, suddenly everybody got so cold we had to dismantle everything and move it inside. So for the next question also goes to film. And it says, with the new wave of nationalism in parts of America and Europe, and increased isolation of people during the pandemic, what is the film industry doing to promote globalism and increase cultural understanding?
One of the things that I found interesting about serving as an ambassador, using these movies to advance our diplomatic objectives, is that Hollywood is a pretty unique asset. For those of you that don't know, I mean, we support about 3 million American jobs and export to about 130 countries around the world in surplus with every single trading relationship. I will say that that the reason we sell so well, the reason we export and sell about 75% of our products abroad, is because we're a reflection of American society. I remember showing a movie in Paris that was an American film, but it was critical of America's role in the last financial crisis. And afterwards, the French would say, you see, Ambassador, America is responsible for all the bad things in the world. And I remember saying to them, when was the last film that was made about the Algerian War? And the reason I mentioned that, and maybe not particularly diplomatic of me, is that we're not afraid as a nation to hold up a mirror and to try to improve, to try to recognize where we haven't done a good job and to try to do better the next time. China, on the other hand, which will be the largest film market probably from now on because of the pandemic, is all internally focused, because the Chinese film business works for the propaganda department. And nobody wants to watch these movies. They're doing literally billions of dollars inside China. So in answer to the question, we don't, it's not the mission of the US entertainment business to advance these ideals that you're referring to. We have never been and will never be a propaganda arm of the US government. But I think it's a pretty good thing when people can see our movies and our creativity and our stories told about American life in the far corners of the earth, showing what America is capable of. So we do it by just simply making these amazing stories well told, but we don't do it with specific intent of changing people's behavior.
I think that is certainly true. If we had any ability to manage what Hollywood does, I'd try to get them to show diplomats differently. I remember once the ambassador from one country came in, and he was, when I was the deputy assistant secretary, and he was complaining vociferously about how his country was portrayed in the movie. And I asked him, had he noticed how the American ambassador was perceived in the movie or shown? Ambassador had been shown as kind of a lying coward crouched under his desk. And ambassador allowed us how he noticed that. I said, well, when I could do something about how they show the ambassador, American ambassador, I'll do something about how they show your country. Another question from your former.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, just on that point, when I was in EB, I had these really creative people who were genius, economic doctorates, and some of the smartest people in the world on the economy working for me in the Economic Bureau. But a lot of them were really creative. And there was a number of them that kept on pitching me ideas, and I hadn't been in the entertainment business in a long, long time, but saying just what you said, that Hollywood there needs to be a movie showing the courage and heroism and the importance of a diplomat. But many diplomats stay behind the scenes and don't go, want to be in the spotlight, and it makes it hard to drive box office with that self-sacrifice and modesty. But anyway, I agree with you completely. Oh, Ambassador, I've lost you. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, when it comes to showing diplomats as heroes, I'm afraid, as one Arab friend said to me once about a different question, you could wait for this sitting down.
They're heroes to me. That's
Now, a serious question. From your former EB perspective, your current role, how do you see the relationship between economic diplomacy and cultural diplomacy?
intertwined. It's my industry is a perfect example of the combination of economic and cultural diplomacy. We're making these movies for, as I said, for broadcast all over the planet, and it generates a tremendous amount of profit and tax-paying dollars for the U.S. government. But it also builds jobs overseas, right? So Universal Pictures is making Jurassic Park in London right now. Warner Brothers is making the new Matrix and the new Batman movies in Berlin. And there's a lot of economic activity generated. In America, every time you make a movie in a major city, it injects $250,000 a day into the local economy, which is extraordinary, because this is not, the industry is not about stars. The industry is about construction workers and electricians and hairdressers and caterers and all these blue collar workers that make up the 3 million Americans that are employed by us or supported by us. So this is a perfect example. We export, it's one of America's greatest exports, but we're also exporting our soft power. So embassies around the planet are using movies as an example of advancing cultural ties as well as economic ties. So I guess the answer to that question is they're completely intertwined, and my space is a good example of that.
Thank you. I want to go back to, I'm going to use a little bit of our time. We had a question for Dr. Reeder that we didn't get to when he was talking. And that question asks, are there instances where the friction that he described eroded America's institutional capacity to govern itself? Or are there instances where it expanded policy coherence, such as the Monroe Doctrine of which you were speaking? It seems to be a most relevant question for today about whether the international friction eroded America's institutional capacity to govern itself. Dr. Reeder, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question. I think it's a great question, but I'll say from the outset, I think it's a difficult question to answer because I think even answering today, what effect does foreign meddling have on our capacity to self-govern? I think that's a difficult question even to ask today, let alone 200 years ago. But I think it's a particularly sticky issue for democracies and republics because the line is so unclear between sort of foreign meddling disinformation campaigns and the democratic process itself. And ambassadors would explicitly use this. Ambassadors and agents of foreign powers would explicitly use that gray area to meddle in elections. In other words, the US Constitution allows the legitimate overthrow of representatives every election cycle. And so ambassadors would attack the administration. This one person who really perfected this was an ambassador named Carlos Martínez de Araujo from Spain. And in 1804, we don't have time to go into all of the details of him, but he basically was attacking the Jefferson administration in the newspapers. And his defense was, look, I'm not trying to overthrow the government itself, but the president is just a caretaker of the government. What I'm doing is completely legitimate because I am speaking to the true sovereigns of the nation, the people. I am going to them, and then they will decide if they want to, turn Jefferson out of office. And so it created a very shady line between foreign meddling. I think today we'd call them foreign disinformation campaigns, and the people's ability to be sovereign over their government and to make their choices in an election. I think it raised two fundamental questions. Do the people have sovereignty over their government? And so can foreign powers legitimately and permissibly influence the parameters of the people's debate about their government. It's a very sticky question for a democracy, I think, for a democracy to resolve.
But it's a sticky one that we have to deal with ourselves in the other direction, because we now have this business of ambassadors reaching out in public diplomacy to populations. And certainly Russia has been very resentful of the way some of our ambassadors have used social media to reach out to the Russian population. So we have to deal with this question both coming and going, and we're probably not going to resolve it.
And if I'm sorry, if I can just clarify one thing real quick, I think now there's a different question where what should we do if actual laws are being broken, whether it's through hacking or anything along that nature, whether it's hacking computer systems or hacking polling systems or ballot systems. I think that's a separate question about what can be done. But when it just comes to sending out disinformation to American voters, that's a really difficult question to deal with. The line becomes very hazy.
Everything gets difficult. Ambassador Rifkin, I'm going to let you come back into this. But also I wanted to, anything you'd like to pick up on in the last discussion, but also another question, as Dr. Reeder showed us, we've been through some difficult periods of foreign relations and sort of put them so far back we don't remember them. Do you see major lingering problems now in our European relations? This is asking you to generalize, but a lot of questions have come up about American reliability, given some of the approaches of this administration. If one posits a change, whether it's in 4 years or now, do you see those suspicions going away, or will they change the playing field in a way that we will have to deal with in some fundamental way in our policy?
Ambassador, I think it's a fantastic question, and I don't know if there's actually an answer for that right now. And I think there are a lot of people that say it depends on who's running America, and I don't want to get into politics. But I will say, when I was ambassador, there was a lot of talk about Bush versus Obama, because I followed the Bush 43 second term. And I would always make the point, I still believe today, that our deep ties with our European friends are cultural, they're economic, they're historical, and they survive any administration. They always have. And the economic ties continued, and the military ties and the intelligence ties with our closest friends continued, regardless of who was in power in the United States. I mentioned in my remarks the new variable here, which is social media and disinformation. And there is turbulence in the water right now based on what seems to be a lack of predictability and stability in American foreign policy. And you see Emmanuel Macron taking a leadership role and saying things publicly like Europe needs to take care of itself in response to America's recent position on NATO. I don't know what's going to happen next. It depends, I think, on whoever wins this election, whether it's Trump's second term or Vice President Biden's first. They're going to need to focus on the European relationship, and they're going to have to restore this trust, because if you believe these Pew Center polls, it's really bad right now. I still believe that in the long arc of history that we have too much in common with our European friends to lose that bond, but it is a bit frayed at the moment. So I think whoever wins this election needs to spend time fixing it.
And that's not going to be as easy as it might be. And it also will take us back to that question that Henry Kissinger posed many years ago. If you want to deal with Europe, what's the telephone number? So on the one hand, we have work to do, but the flip side of the question is, do you see Europe becoming somehow more coherent so that it can work together, so we can work together if we're willing to work together?
Yeah, it's an opportunity for them. Of course, Brexit does throw a wrench in that, but yeah, it's a real opportunity to force better collaboration inside the union.
There's another question. Russia's been a big part of this conversation, of this conference, and also part of U.S. relations with Europe. And what has your experience been in your prior experience with Russia's desire for influence as an ambassador, but also what's been your experience leading the MPA as far as Russia's approach to things like digital rights and privacy?
I I enjoyed my time as ambassador. I was friendly with the Russian ambassador to Paris, and we spent a lot of time together. And it was interesting to hear his talking points when I would, push his buttons. But there was no major interaction with me as a bilateral ambassador with on Russian-related issues. On the entertainment side, people don't really know this, but Russia is a major market for entertainment properties, and it's a really important market for us, and has been ever since World War II. And any turbulence in that relationship is bad for our business. But Ambassador, I know what I don't know. I'm not a Russian expert. I have not devoted any of my life and career to that. I fear that I'll never be able to visit Russia, because when I was at the State Department, I was in charge of sanctions. It was hard for me to get a visa the last time I tried to go. But fortunately, we have a powerful team at the Motion Picture Association that spends a lot of time there trying to advance our interests.
Well, that is a fascinating aspect. I have one small question that came up. At one point, apparently the French used to prohibit the visit of nuclear ships. Is that still a question? And is that an issue of any larger rub in Europe? That's
really funny. I didn't know that happened in the past. During my time, I'd say 50% of the Nimitz class carriers stopped in Marseille. And I have about 7 or so hats that I have on my shelf from my visits to the nuclear powered carriers. And the reason why is that America at the time had 11 Nimitz carriers, and I guess the Ford class is an upgrade from the Nimitz. And we have a couple coming online. But the Nimitz carrier was the only other nuclear powered carriers on the planet were the French ones. And the French only have one, the Charles de Gaulle. And the Charles de Gaulle is about 50% of the size of a Nimitz carrier. And so when the Truman or the Eisenhower or the Bush or any of these things came to, the French, I would take them out, on the COD, on the onboard delivery vehicle. And they were it was the most amazing representation event to take French business leaders and politicians to this floating fortress surrounded, by our incredible, impressive military. Unfortunately for me, and again, I was so enthusiastic in my role as ambassador that I just said yes whenever my defense attaché asked me to do something. As I told you in my remarks, when I landed in Normandy, it was in front of the then Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, and Mabus said, yeah, you may think that's special, Ambassador, but you've never been up on an F-18 Super Hornet. And I said, well, it's because you got to get water trained, and I can't do that. And he goes, well, I'm going to waive the training. You go ahead and go up on this plane, and I go, well, if you're waiving the training, why do you have a training? And he says, because it's either, if it falls, it's either going to crash when it takes off or when it lands. And if it does, you're going to be dead anyway. So you don't need to be trained. He was just trying to spook me. But I did go up on an F-18 with the Navy. And they were doing interoperability exercises between the Charles de Gaulle and the Truman at the time, where the Rafale fighters were doing dogfights with our F-18s. And one of the Rafales hit the water and bust up, and we rescued the pilot. And I was asking the naval aviators about that afterwards, and they said that the F-18 is just a superior machine, and the French should never have tried the exercise, But I guess the point I'm making here is, yeah, it was huge intersection. France embraced having these carriers come to town. So I don't know when that changed, but when I was in Paris, it was very much embraced by the French military.
That is fascinating. I guess I remember we were competing once with the British for some sale, and they were talking about trying to sell an aircraft carrier, and I said, well, yes, we ought to buy one of your carriers too. We could park it on the back of ours as like a spare tire. It didn't go over well. I think we have actually run out our appointed time, and to my amazement, we have kept the vast majority of our audience, or they've been replaced by others. I don't know which. So at this point, first of all, Ambassador Rivkin, thank you for a very well-designed and well-delivered closing speech, keynote, which has, I think, ended the our formal conference on the same high note that we started on, with Dr. Reeder's absolutely fascinating reminder of how much of past is prologue. And then I want to thank all three of our panelists, Ambassador Donnelly, Ambassador Spratlen, and Ambassador Hunter, who all enriched this conversation, many different aspects. My great thanks to Maria Reisaus and to Destiny Clements of my staff, Whitney Pippin of the Monticello staff, who worked so hard to make sure that this worked and works today. And thankfully, frankly, and lastly, my real appreciation to Andrew O'Shaughnessy. We have been partnered now. How many years did you say, Andrew, that we've been partnered? Yeah.
This is the 11th year of conferences, but we first started talking in 2008.
So this is actually the 12th time we've been together. The first time we haven't been able to actually physically be there, but hopefully by next year we'll be back in force. And so my huge thanks to you for this continuing cooperation, for all of your help and support, and to all those who came and joined us online. And I know this was a little longer than the average Zoom conference, but I thought it was splendid. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And with that, Andrew, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, for those of you joining us for the first time, the slide during the lunch showed the view from Monte Alto overlooking Monticello and the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that's the view that we normally have during these conferences. So I hope next year you'll consider joining us on Monte Alto, and I hope we're in operation next year and able to hold these conferences physically. We do them every year, usually the last Saturday in October. Ambassador Newman always brings what I joke is a movable feast, and we certainly had a feast today. I'm very grateful for Ambassador Rivkin, Spratlen, Hunter, and Donnelly. When Ambassador Rivkin was telling his anecdote about parachuting in over Normandy, it reminded me of the story of Alan Boyd, who sadly just passed away in the last 2 days. He was the last surviving member of Lyndon Johnson's administration, in which he was a young Secretary of Transport. And he described to me how, as a young man on Victory Day, he found himself flying over in a troop carrier over Paris at nighttime, and he couldn't resist diving down almost to street level and flying over the crowd. And it made him wince years later, thinking about it, if another pilot had decided to do the same thing, coming in the opposite direction. But it's memories, shared memories like that, and that, you know, there are records of that day that describe this mysterious plane, American plane, appearing just over head level. Those are bonds that no temporary changes in American policy towards Europe will really shake. They will remain very deep. I'm very grateful to Tyson Reeder, and I'm sure he was pleased to hear from Ambassador Newman how much we welcome the fact that his comments and his historical perspective was so well tailored to this particular topic. And finally, I noticed that Mary Scott Fleming was online. She, for years, was the person who organized this event. She's now retired and living in Sarasota, so we'd love to say hello to her. And Robert Beecroft, Ambassador Beecroft, who has also been a great advocate of this collaboration with the American Academy of Diplomacy, which we want to continue another 11 years. Thank you.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you again. I think we are adjourned.